following report appeared in the Argus News of Saturday the 28th of July, 1883. Truth is said to be stranger than fiction, and certainly the extraordinary murder which took place in Melbourne on Friday morning goes a long way towards verifying this saying. A crime has been committed by an unknown assassin within a short distance of the principal streets of this great city, and is surrounded by an impenetrable mystery. Indeed, from the nature of the crime itself, the place where it was committed, and the fact that the assassin has escaped without leaving a trace behind him, it would seem as though the case itself had been taken bodily from one of Gaboriau's novels, and that his famous detective Lecoq alone would be able to unravel it. The facts of the matter are simply these. At the hour of 20 minutes to 2 o'clock in the morning, a hansom cab drove up to the police station in Grey Street, St Kilda, and the driver made the startling statement that his cab contained the body of a man who he had reason to believe had been murdered. The cabman, who gave his name as Malcolm Royston, related the following strange story. At the hour of 1 o'clock in the morning, he was driving down Collins Street East when he was hailed by a gentleman standing at the corner by the Scotch Church. He immediately stopped and saw that the gentleman was supporting another who appeared to be intoxicated. Both were in evening dress, and the first gentleman wore a short overcoat of a light fawn colour, which was open. This gentleman said, "Look here, cabby, here's some fellow awfully tight, you'd better take him home." Royston asked him if the drunken man was his friend, but this the man denied, saying that he had just picked him up from the footpath, and did not know him from Adam. At this moment the individual in question turned his face up to the light, and the sober gentleman did seem to recognize him, for he recoiled a pace, letting the drunken man fall in a heap on the pavement. Gasping out, "You!" he turned on his heel and walked rapidly away. The intoxicated individual had struggled to his feet and was holding on to the lamp-post, swaying to and fro. "I want to go home," he said. "St Kilda." He then tried to get into the cab, but was too drunk to do so. Royston got down and helped him into the cab. The man fell back into the seat and seemed to drop off to sleep. Royston turned to remount his driving seat and found the first gentleman standing close to his elbow. He said, "I've changed my mind. I will see him home." And he opened the door of the cab, stepped in, and told Royston to drive down to St Kilda. Royston drove as he had been directed, but near the Church of England Grammar School on the St Kilda road, the sober gentleman called out to him to stop, and got out of the cab. "He won't let me take him home," he said, "so I'll just walk back to the city and you can drive him to St Kilda." "What street, sir?" "Grey Street, I fancy, but my friend will direct you when you get to the junction." He then opened the door of the cab and looked in. "Good night, old man," he said, but the other apparently did not answer, for the gentleman shrugged his shoulders and, muttering "sulky brute," closed the door again. He then gave Royston half a sovereign, lit a cigarette, and after making a few remarks about the beauty of the night, walked off quickly in the direction of Melbourne. Royston drove down to the junction, and having stopped there according to his instructions, he asked his fare several times where he was to drive him to. Receiving no response, and thinking that the man was too drunk to answer, he got down from his seat, opened the door of the cab, and found him lying back in the corner with a handkerchief tied tightly across his mouth. Royston put out his hand with the intention of rousing him, thinking that he had gone to sleep, but on touching him, the deceased fell forward, and on examination, to his horror, the cabman found that he was quite dead. The deceased is a slender man of medium height with a dark complexion. There were no papers or cards found on the body from which his name could be discovered, and his clothing was not marked in any way. The handkerchief, however, which was tied across his mouth, was of white silk and marked in one of the corners with the letters O.W. in red silk. The assassin, of course, may have used his own handkerchief to commit the crime, so if the initials are those of his name, they may ultimately lead to his detection. It is of the utmost importance that the mystery should be cleared up, not only in the interests of justice, but also in those of the public, taking place as it did in a public conveyance and in the public street. To think that the author of such a crime is at present at large, walking in our midst, and perhaps preparing for the committal of another, is enough to shake the strongest nerves. In one of Dubois-Gobet's stories, entitled An Omnibus Mystery, a murder closely resembling this tragedy takes place in an omnibus, but we question if even that famous author would have been daring enough to write about a crime being committed in such an unlikely place as a hansom cab. Here is a great chance for some of our detectives to render themselves famous, and we feel sure that they will do their utmost to trace the author of this cowardly and dastardly murder. At the inquest on the deceased, the following articles taken from the body were placed on the table: £2 10 in gold and silver, the white silk handkerchief, a cigarette case half filled with old Judge cigarettes, and a left-hand white glove of kid leather with black seams down the back. Inspector Samuel Gorby of the Detective Office was present in order to see if anything might be said by the witnesses likely to point to the cause or to the author of the crime. The first witness called was Malcolm Royston, in whose cab the crime had been committed. He told the same story as had already appeared in the Argus, and was then questioned by the coroner. "Can you give a description of the gentleman in the light coat who was holding the deceased when you drove up?" "He was fair, I think, because I could see his moustache, and rather tall. I could not see his face very plainly, as he wore a soft felt hat pulled down over his eyes." "Did you hear any sounds of fighting or struggling in the cab during the drive?" "No. The road was rather rough, and the noise of the wheels going over the stones would have prevented my hearing anything." "When the gentleman in the light coat got out, did he appear disturbed?" "No, he was perfectly calm." "Were his clothes torn or disarranged in any way?" "No. The only difference I remarked in him was that his coat was buttoned." "And was it open when he got in?" "No, but it was when he was holding up the deceased." "Did you notice any striking peculiarity about him?" "Well, no, except that he wore a diamond ring." "What was there peculiar about that?" "He wore it on the forefinger of the right hand. I never saw it that way before." At the conclusion of Royston's evidence, during which Inspector Gorby had been continually taking notes, Dr. Robert Chinston was called. He deposed, "I made a post-mortem examination of the deceased. Externally, the body was healthy-looking and well-nourished. There were no marks of violence. The handkerchief, which was tied lightly over the mouth, was saturated with chloroform, and I am of the opinion that the deceased died from the inhalation of that vapour. There was a fatty degeneration of the heart, which would have had a decided tendency to accelerate the fatal result." Dr. Chinston was then permitted to retire, and Clement Rankin, another cabman, was called. He deposed, "I drive a hansom cab. Thursday last, about 1:30, at a short distance past the grammar school, I was hailed by a gentleman in a light coat smoking a cigarette. He told me to drive him to Powlett Street, East Melbourne. I did so, and he got out at the corner of Wellington Parade and Powlett Street. He paid me half a sovereign for my fare, and then walked up Powlett Street while I drove back to town." "What time was it when you stopped at Powlett Street?" 2 o'clock exactly. I heard the post-office clock strike 2 o'clock. Did you notice anything peculiar about the man in the light coat?" "No, he looked just the same as anyone else. I thought he was some swell out for a lark. His hat was pulled down over his eyes, and I couldn't see his face." "Did you notice if he wore a ring?" "Yes, I did. When he was handing me the half-sovereign, I saw he had a diamond ring on the forefinger of his right hand." The jury retired at 4 o'clock, and, after an absence of a quarter of an hour, returned with the following verdict: that the deceased whose name there is no evidence to determine, died on the 27th day of July from the effects of poison, namely chloroform, feloniously administered by some person unknown. And the jury, on their oaths, say that the said unknown person feloniously, wilfully, and maliciously did murder the said deceased. £100 reward. Notice is hereby given that a reward of £100 will be paid by the government for such information as will lead to the conviction of the murderer, who is presumed to be the man who entered the hansom cab with the deceased. £100 reward. "Well," said Mr. Samuel Gorby, addressing his reflection in the looking-glass, "I've been finding out things these last 20 years, but this is a puzzler and no mistake." Mr. Gorby was shaving, and, as was his usual custom, conversed with his reflection. Being a detective and of an extremely reticent disposition, he never talked outside about his business or made a confidant of anyone. When he did want to unbosom himself, he retired to his bedroom and talked to his reflection in the mirror. He made his mirror his confidant, and so far it had never betrayed him, while for the rest it joyed him to see his own jolly red face nodding gravely at him from out the shining surface, like a mandarin. This morning the detective was unusually animated in his confidences to his mirror. At times, too, a puzzled expression would pass over his face. The hansom cab murder had been placed in his hands for solution, and he was trying to think how he should make a beginning. "Hang it," he said, thoughtfully stropping his razor. "A thing with an end must have a start, and if I don't get the start, how am I to get the end? Here's a man, well, say a gentleman, who gets drunk, and therefore don't know what he's up to. Another gent who is on the square comes up and sings out for a cab for him. First he says he don't know him, and then he shows plainly he does. He walks away in a temper, changes his mind, comes back and gets into the cab. Then he polishes the drunk one off with chloroform, gets out of the cab, and vanishes. Well, that's the riddle I've got to find out, and I don't think the Sphinx ever had a harder one. There are 3 things to be discovered. First, who is the dead man? Second, what was he killed for? And third, who did it? Once I get hold of the first, the other 2 won't be very hard to find out, for one can tell pretty well from a man's life whether it's to anyone's interest that he should be got off the books. The man that murdered that chap must have had some strong motive, and I must find out what that motive was. Love? No, it wasn't that. Men in love don't go to such lengths in real life. They do in novels and plays, but I've never seen it occurring in my experience. Robbery? No. There was plenty of money left in the dead man's pocket. Revenge? No. Really, it might be that. It's a kind of thing that carries most people further than they want to go. By the way, I don't think I examined his clothes sufficiently. There might be something about them to give a clue. I'll start with his clothes. So Mr. Gorby, having dressed and breakfasted, walked quickly to the police station, where he asked for the clothes of the deceased to be shown to him. When he received them, he retired into a corner and commenced an exhaustive examination. There was nothing remarkable about the jacket, so with a grunt of dissatisfaction, Mr. Gorby threw it aside and picked up the waistcoat. Here he found something to interest him, in the shape of a pocket made on the left-hand side and on the inside of the garment. Now, what the deuce is this for? It ain't usual for a dress waistcoat to have a pocket on its inside, as I'm aware of. And this ain't tailor's work. He did it himself. And jolly badly he did it too. Now, he must have taken the trouble to make this pocket himself so that no one else would know anything about it. And it was made to hold something valuable, so valuable, that he had to carry it with him even when he wore evening clothes. Ah, here's a tear on the side. Something has been pulled out roughly. I begin to see now. The dead man possessed something which the other man wanted, and which he knew the dead one carried about with him. He sees him drunk, gets into the cab with him, and tries to get what he wants. The dead man resists, upon which the other kills him, snatches what he wants out of the pocket so quickly that he tears it, and then makes off. The question is, what was it the assassin wanted? A case with jewels? No. It could not have been anything so bulky. It was something flat, which could easily lie in the pocket. A paper. Some valuable document. Mr. Gorby threw down the waistcoat. That's all very well, but I've found number 2 before number 1. The first question is, who is the murdered man? He's a stranger in Melbourne, that's pretty clear, or else someone would have been sure to recognise it by the description given in the newspapers. He can't have lived in an hotel, as the landlord of any hotel would have recognised him from the description, especially when the whole city is ringing with the murder. Private lodgings, more like, and a landlady who doesn't read the papers and doesn't gossip, or she'd have known all about it by this time. Now, if he suddenly disappeared, his landlady would naturally have wanted to make inquiries. But if he was a stranger, she wouldn't have known where to inquire. So, the most natural thing for her to do would be to advertise for him. I'll have a look at the newspapers. Mr. Gorby got a file of the different newspapers and looked carefully through those columns in which missing friends and people who will hear something to their advantage are generally advertised for. In Friday's issue, exactly 1 week after the murder, Mr. Gorby suddenly came upon the following advertisement. If Mr. Oliver White does not return to Possum Villa, Grey Street, St. Kilda, before the end of the week, his rooms will be let again. Rubina Hamilton. Oliver White, repeated Mr. Gorby slowly. And the initials on the pocket handkerchief were O.W. So his name is Oliver White, is it? Now, I wonder if Rubina Hamilton knows anything about this matter. Well, as I'm fond of sea breezes, I think I'll go down and call at Possum Villa, Grey Street, St. Kilda. Mrs. Rubina Hamilton was a lady with a grievance, as anybody who happened to become acquainted with her soon found out. It is Beaconsfield who says in one of his novels that no one is so interesting as when he is talking about himself, and judging Mrs. Hamilton by this statement, she was an extremely fascinating individual. Mrs. Hamilton's particular grievance was want of money, since owing to a bad husband she had failed to save any. The late Mr. Hamilton, for he had long since departed this life, had been addicted to alcohol, and at those times when he should have been earning, he was usually to be found in a drinking shanty, spending his wife's earnings in shouting for himself and his friends. The constant drinking and the hot Victorian climate had soon carried him off. Small wonder, then, that Mrs. Hamilton should condense all her knowledge of the male sex into the one bitter aphorism, "Men is brutes." Even the richest and most fashionable of suburbs must, perforce, have its less pretentious areas, and Melbourne's St. Kilda obediently followed this rule of nature. Possum Villa was no luxurious seafront mansion, but a homely-looking place with one bow window. It was surrounded by a small garden, in which were a few sparse flowers, the especial delight of Mrs. Hamilton. It was her way to tie an old handkerchief round her head and to go out into the garden and dig and water her beloved flowers until, from sheer desperation at the overwhelming odds, they gave up all attempt to grow. She was engaged in this favourite occupation about a week after her lodger had gone. She wondered where he was. "Lying drunk in a public house, I'll be bound," she said, viciously pulling up a weed. "A-spending his rent on beer. Many's brutes, drat 'em." Just as she said this, a shadow fell across the garden, and on looking up she saw a man leaning over the fence, staring at her. "You're taking a plan of the house to rob it, are you?" she said. "Well, you needn't, 'cause there ain't nothing to rob. The silver spoons has belonged to me father's mother, having gone down my husband's throat long ago, and I ain't had money to buy more. I'll thank you to leave the fence I bought with me own hard-earned money alone and get out." "Does Mr. Oliver White live here?" asked the stranger. "He do and he don't," answered Mrs. Hableton, epigrammatically. "I ain't seen him for over a week, so I suppose he's gone on the drink, like the rest of them. But I'll put something in the paper as'll pull him up pretty sharp, and let him know I ain't a carpet to be trod on, and if you're a friend of his, you can tell him from me he's a brute, and it's no more but what I expected of him being a male." The man waited placidly during this outburst, and Mrs. Hableton having stopped for want of breath, he interposed quietly, "What is he like?" "Not very tall, dark face, no whiskers or moustache. He told me just come from England." "A stranger, and fits the description. The very man," said Gorby to himself. "I'm on the right path." "Can I speak to you for a few moments?" Mrs. Hableton walked to the gate and opened it with a jerk. "Use your legs and walk in," she said, and the stranger having done so, she led the way into the house and into a small, neat sitting-room which seemed to overflow with antimacassars, wool mats, and wax flowers. There were also a row of emu eggs on the mantelpiece, a cutlass on the wall, and a grimy line of hard-looking little books set in a stiff row on a shelf, presumably for ornament, for their appearance in no way tempted one to read them. The furniture was of horsehair, and everything was hard and shiny. So when the stranger sat down in the slippery-looking armchair that Mrs. Hableton pushed towards him, he could not help thinking it had been stuffed with stones. The lady herself sat opposite to him in another hard chair, and having taken the handkerchief off her head, folded it carefully, laid it on her lap, and then looked straight at her unexpected visitor. "Now then, who are you, what are you, and what do you want?" The stranger placed his hat on the table and answered deliberately. "My name is Gorby. I am a detective. I want Mr. Oliver White." "He ain't here." "I know that." "Then where is he?" Mr. Gorby answered abruptly and watched the effect of his words. "He is dead." Mrs. Hableton grew pale and pushed back her chair. "No," she cried. "He never killed him, did he?" "Who never killed him?" Mrs. Hableton did not answer, but rising from her seat went over to a hard and shiny-looking sideboard, from whence she took a bottle of brandy and a small wine-glass. Half filling the glass, she drank it off. "I don't take much of that stuff," she said, seeing the detective's eyes fixed curiously on her. "But you've given me such a turn that I must take something to steady me nerves. What do you want me to do?" "Tell me all you know," said Mr. Gorby, keeping his eyes fixed on her face. Mrs. Hableton drew a deep breath. "Where was Mr. White killed?" "He was murdered in a hansom cab on the St. Kilda Road." "In the open street?" "Yes, in the open street." "Oh." She closed her mouth firmly. Mr. Gorby said nothing. He saw that she was deliberating whether or not to speak, and a word from him might seal her lips, so like a wise man he kept silent. He obtained his reward sooner than he expected. Mrs. Hableton shivered slightly, though the room was quite warm. "I'll tell you all I know. Mr. Oliver White took the rooms 2 months ago. He was quite the gentleman. He told me he was a-going to marry an heiress." "Did he, indeed?" "He took the rooms, and said he'd stay with me for 6 months and paid a week's rent in advance, and he always paid up regular like a respectable man, though I don't believe in him myself. He said he'd lots of friends and used to go out every night." "Who were his friends?" "That I can't tell you, for he were very close. He had only one friend as I ever saw, a Mr. Morland, who comed here with him and was always with him brother-like." "And what sort of a man is Mr. Morland?" "Good-looking enough, but his habits weren't as good as his face, and handsome is as handsome does, is what I say." "Where is Mr. Morland to be found?" "Not knowing, can't tell. He used to be here regular, but I ain't seen him for over a week." "Strange. Very," said Gorby, shaking his head. "I should like to see this Mr. Morland. I suppose it's probable he'll call again?" "I suppose he will." Mostly called at night. Ah, then I'll come down this evening on chance of seeing him. Coincidences happen in real life as well as in novels. Now, what else about Mr. White? About 2 weeks ago, or 3, not certain which, a gentleman called to see him. He was very tall and wore evening dress with a light coat over it and a soft hat. The very man, said the detective below his breath. Go on. He went into Mr. White's room and shut the door. I don't know how long they were talking together, but I was sitting in this very room and heard their voices get angry, and they were a-swearing at one another, which is the way with men, the brutes. I got up and went into the passage to ask them not to make such a noise when Mr. White's door opens and a gentleman in the coat comes out and bangs along to the front door. Mr. White comes to the door of his room and he hollers out, "She is mine, you can't do anything." The other turns and says, "I can kill you if you marry her. I'll do it even in the open street." "Ah," said Mr. Gorby. "And then?" "Then the man in the coat bangs the door to, which it's never shut easy since I ain't got no money to get it put right, and Mr. White walks back to his room, laughing." "And what was the stranger's name?" "That I don't know, as Mr. White never told me. He was very tall, with a fair moustache." Mr. Gorby was satisfied. "That is the man," he said to himself, "who got into the hansom cab and murdered White. There's no doubt of it. White and he were rivals for the heiress." "What do you think of it?" said Mrs. Hableton curiously. "I think," said Mr. Gorby slowly, with his eyes fixed on her, "I think that there is a woman at the bottom of this crime."